my name is Carol and I'm here to talk to you about the challenges of importing international human rights laws into states with indigenous communities. Let's start. Did you know that there are over 5,000 indigenous nations in the world? Their territories cover over 20% of the world's surface. And yet despite all of this, they seem to be constantly facing challenges in terms of entitlement over natural resources and human rights. Still, there has been an increase of attempts in trying to import international human rights laws. Countries with indigenous populations such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States of America, and Finland are actually signatories to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, aka the ICCPR, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, aka the UN DRIP. Now, what is the UN DRIP? The UN DRIP was created through widespread communication and consultation with indigenous peoples, and it represents a solemn but respectful response from the international community towards the indigenous community. There have been many positive things that have flowed from international human rights law. The supernatural character of international human rights law have allowed indigenous people to rely on legal arguments that are enshrined in international human rights documents such as the ICCPR and the UN DRIP that are not restricted to domestic legislation. The most obvious concrete domestic benefit that we've seen in Australia would be the enactment of the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, aka the RDA. However, despite our attempts to advocate for Indigenous rights, it was really due to the perseverance of the Indigenous people themselves that enabled the sustainment of their own culture and autonomy. Now, there are a couple of barriers when it comes to importing international human rights laws into states with indigenous communities. Firstly, international human rights law might not necessarily have the same idea of human rights as the indigenous community. In a year 2000 report on the rights of indigenous peoples, the Inter-American Commission made a statement that international human rights law fails to recognize the nature and complexities of indigenous peoples. For example, Indigenous sovereignty. The international definition of sovereignty stemmed from the end of World War II, where Hitler's outrageous acts against humanities triggered a radical change in international law. The notion of sovereignty evolved from a state and territorial sovereignty to an individualistic sense of self-determination and autonomy. According to Federico Lanzarini, the author of The Culturalization of Human Rights Law, the evolution of international law meant a projection of the same definition of sovereignty onto indigenous people. We need to understand that the indigenous concept of sovereignty is not restricted to Western ideals. I'd like to coin my second point, the domestic limitation. Now, the challenge of moving international human rights law from the global to the local is due to political and legal limitations. Let's first look at domestic legal limitations. The importation of international human rights law is heavily dependent on ratification by domestic governments. It is not enough for a state to be a signatory of a UN convention, it actually has to enact it into local law for there to be real effect. Also, domestic legal systems' recognition of indigenous rights is only to the extent that it does not infringe on the main state's power. Even in the famous Mabo case, where the High Court of Australia acknowledged and recognized the ongoing form of Indigenous title, the court only did so in a way that placed such rights in an inferior position to most other land titles. Which means that native title was not only reliant on recognition by common law, but it was also subject to possible extinguishment by a unilateral exercise of power by the Crown. In the words of prominent Indigenous leader Mick Dodson, we know that the High Court attempted to accommodate Indigenous law and custom within the colonial common law, but it was only able to understand our law and custom from within the framework of Eurocentric colonial legal and political systems. So far under legal limitations, under domestic limitations, we've talked about ratification by domestic governments and also Indigenous rights subject to state power. Now, if it's okay with you, I would like to talk about Australia for a second, just because I think this is so important. Disappointingly, in Australia, we have an absence of a Bill of Rights. Now, because there is no enshrined recognition of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders' rights in domestic legislation, they do face considerable challenges when it comes to trying to support their claims and rely on any sort of framework. #bummer. Our Commonwealth Constitution was primarily designed to protect Commonwealth supremacy. From the case of Cartieri and the Commonwealth, Although the Commonwealth Parliament does have power to legislate with respect to Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander peoples, based on Section 51, subsection 26 of the Constitution, there is no requirement that such legislation be for the benefit of Indigenous people. And again, therefore, Australia is merely one example of an unconducive domestic legal environment which restricts the full importation of international human rights law. So we've talked about domestic legal limitations. Now let's talk about domestic political limitations. There is significant correlation between the political conditions of a country and their approach to Indigenous rights. For instance, from 1972 to 1975, the Australian Labor Party, headed by Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, adopted some effective policies which increased Australia's influence in the international community and also served to advocate for Indigenous rights. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum, where the Conservative Liberal Party under Prime Minister Howard was arguably slightly more apathetic to the cries of Indigenous rights. This was seen in the government's determination to proceed with the Native Title Amendment Act of 1998, despite the criticisms from the UN Committee on the Elimination on Racial Discrimination. And again, #bummer. As you can see, the approach and effectiveness of importing international human rights laws is heavily dependent on the domestic political climate of that place. So, as a quick summary of the problems, first, international human rights laws might not have the same definition or concept of human rights as the Indigenous community. And then we have the domestic limitations, where the importation of such human rights is hampered by the political and legal context of the society. Solutions! To reconcile the international and Indigenous concept of human rights, the international community must expand its understanding of human rights. In the words of Natalia Alvarez, expert in human rights law in the University of Aberdeen, this requires a new theory of rights recognition, in which alternative approaches to the nation-state model are considered. Now, according to Elena Serkovic, professor at Simon Fraser University, this can be achieved by being open to constant negotiation and also constantly challenging the existing boundaries to international human rights. Now moving on to the domestic solution. Now, a good start to improving the legal conditions of a country is to actually start ratifying the conventions we sign, because then it becomes legally binding in our country. Another good example is to actually have the judiciary and legislature take into greater consideration Indigenous cultures and laws in decision making. Now let's look at the case of Loboto and Suriname. This was a case of killings that involved a polygamous, matriarchal and non-caste society. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights took into consideration the traditions and social structure of the Indigenous community. Also, in addition to just determining individual reparations, the court responded to claims of collective reparations. Though this was a regional court, in the same way, domestic courts and legislatures can also take into consideration Indigenous cultures and traditions in decision-making and lawmaking. This way, domestic rights will be less reliant on the state's legal structure and more so a part of the state's legal structure. And of course, we can definitely shape the political conditions of our society. Just as political culture can dampen the potency of international human rights law in a country, it can also act to promote it. A really important step is to educate our local community, including students, politicians, and lawyers, to be culturally intelligent. Now, here's what cultural intelligence isn't. It's not about whether you like to order Chinese takeaway twice a week, or that you play Pokemon Go, or that you like to say namaste, or that you have at least one friend that's a person of color. No. According to E.T. Hall's Iceberg, cultural intelligence is not only understanding the surface and shallow culture, but also deep culture. That is how different cultures perceive their identities, how they approach problem solving, and what it means to them to be sovereign. Deep culture is what our society should be educated on. This way, we can truly groom a generation that truly understands, respects, and responds to Indigenous needs. If we can shift the political atmosphere of a country, then the legal atmosphere would also be likely to follow to embrace Indigenous rights to better import international human rights law. In summary, the world has come such a long way in incorporating international human rights laws into states with Indigenous communities. But there is always room for self-improvement. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to live in a flawless utopian society, but through broadening our definition of human rights to be all-inclusive, ratifying international human rights treaties into domestic legislation, incorporating Indigenous values, traditions, social structures into our legal system, and strengthening our cultural intelligence, especially among the younger generation, I have no doubt that we will see a better importation of true international human rights laws into states with Indigenous communities. And that is it! So thank you so much for watching till the end of this video and educating yourself. It really means a lot to me. Bye!